The air over Europe, by the middle of the war, was no longer made just of oxygen and clouds. It was dense, heavy with the smoke of distant cities and the cold echo of machines that crossed the line between heaven and hell. It was a theater of the Great Bombing Offensive, the Allied doctrine that sought to dismantle, piece by piece, the industrial and moral heart of the German regime. At the core of the strategy, imposing, was the B-17 Flying Fortress. For the Allied forces, it was a symbol of industrial capacity. For the German Luftwaffe pilots, it was a metal enigma, 16 tons of steel, arriving in cohesive formations, like a wall of fire that seemed impossible to tear down. With every mission, every assault, German officers struggled to find the flaw, the blind spot that would turn that fortress into ruins. The war for them was an equation of survival, and the B-17 was the insoluble variable. But war, like life, is made of accidents. It is not about bravery or infallible planning, but about small mistakes, a mechanical failure at the wrong moment, a hasty decision. And so, at some point in that brutal conflict, one or more of these B-17s ended up resting on German soil, reasonably intact. They were unexpected trophies, but what they represented was far more than the simple loss of an enemy plane. They were an opportunity, a technical and psychological window into the heart of Allied strategy. One aircraft, in particular, a B-17F, captured after a forced landing, was in near-flying condition, requiring only minor repairs. This plane, soon to sport the black dollar Balkan Kreisdollar of the Luftwaffe dollar instead of the American White Star, will become the key to a secret and profound experiment. The project was codenamed Zirkus Rosarius and later incorporated into Kampfgeschwader $200, KG-200, the Special Missions Unit. The aircraft would undergo a rigorous technical and flight evaluation, flown by some of the most experienced German test pilots and aces. The mission was not just to learn how to shoot down the B-17. It was to understand the mindset behind its construction. They needed to know what the enemy relied upon to stay alive 10,000 meters up, at a temperature that froze the soul. Curiosity and fear walked hand in hand in those secret hangars. What they discovered, however, was more than the simple geometry of a bomber. The flight test took place at isolated bases, away from curious eyes and Allied bombers. Inside the cockpit, the German pilots, accustomed to the Spartan layout of Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, were immediately impressed by the B-17. It was not just large, it was complex. The 10 crew members, a number almost unthinkable for German design philosophies, had at their disposal a volume of radio, navigation, and defensive equipment that indicated a clear priority: the survival of the mission and the crew. They noted the redundancy, the strategic armoring in key locations, and above all, the concentration of defensive firepower. 1350 caliber machine guns, each with the potential to shred the metal of a fighter. What followed was not just a technical assessment, but a role reversal with a deep psychological tension. The German pilots flew the very plane they had tried to shoot down for months. They sought the vulnerabilities they exploited. They flew in formation, simulating the attack of their own fighters. The test pilot observed through the sights, no longer as an enemy, but as an intruder inside the fortress itself. He perceived the bomber's slowness, the rigidity of its formation, but also its incredible resilience. The B-17 was a machine built to absorb punishment. It was a plane where the engineering seemed to have anticipated the pain. The great revelation, the turning point in the analysis, was not the discovery of design flaw, but the confirmation of a distinct philosophy of war. The B-17 was not just a plane. It was a system of logistics and faith. With every 17 bombs released, every fragment of metal flying in response to the German fighters, there was an implicit certainty that even if that plane fell, another would follow, and another and another. What the Luftwaffe officers found in the test was not a technical failure, but the vast, almost inexhaustible production capacity of the enemy. They flew the plane, and, in doing so, they flew in the face of inevitability. The test engineer who examined the damaged B-17 fuselage left a trail of his impressions in an internal report, a fragment of paper that survived the destruction of archives. He wrote, "The metal cladding is no better than ours. The speed is inferior, but the tolerance for damage is inhuman. We found over 200 machine gun holes, and the structure was still solid. The enemy built not a fortress, but a phantom. The historian reflects, it is in this recognition of inhuman tolerance that the real fear lies. It is not superior quality, but incalculable quantity and resilience. It is the mathematics of war turning into a nightmare. In another record, a personal diary found at the post of a young Luftwaffe fighter pilot who participated in simulated firing exercises against the captured B-17. The tone was one of weariness. We were told to shoot at the rudder, the engine at specific points. But when it flew, I only saw the windows. And I imagined the face of the tail gunner, his eyes protected by goggles and his tired hands on the trigger. It wasn't a target. It was 10 men. And our mission was to turn them into nothing. The historian comments, strategic bombing has the power to dehumanize. You shoot at a dot, a formation, a map, but the war forced even the enemy to glimpse the humanity on the other side, even if only for an instant. The dilemma is not the crash of the plane, but the conscience of who is inside it. A memo from a high-ranking strategist, addressed to a fighter command, revealed the coldness of the calculation. Head-on attacks are most effective. Cockpit armor is minimal. The risk to the fighter pilot is high, but the bomber formation is most vulnerable to aggressive attacks from the front. Sacrifice is the acceptable cost to break through this wall of fire. The narrator pauses. It is in this kind of phrase that loyalty becomes a prison. The commander orders a sacrifice, transforming the value of the individual into a necessary statistic for the plan. The true climax of fear is not the engine that explodes, but the order that destroys conscience. What remains of freedom when obedience demands one's very life? Finally, the testimony of a woman, a civilian, who lived near one of the test bases and saw the B-17 with German insignia many years later in a memoir. The German planes had a harsh, fast sound. This new plane, with the odd tail, made a heavy, measured noise. It was a sound of work, not of hunting, and it was a sound that brought the war from afar. Even painted with our markings, it looked foreign, a sign that something we could no longer control was approaching. The historian concludes, fear has its own acoustics. The B-17, even flying for the Luftwaffe, carried the sound of inevitability. It was a symbol of a capacity that transcended the skill of a pilot or the quality of an engine. It was a materialization of the strength of an entire nation placed in the sky. The captured B-17 experiment culminated in two bitter consequences. Strategically, the Luftwaffe obtained crucial information. They learned about the bomber's defenses, its cruising speeds, and its maneuverability vulnerabilities. This information was vital for developing new attack tactics, such as the head-on pass, the frontal attack, which targeted the least protected areas of the cockpit. There was a brief period of success, an increase in Allied losses, showing lethality of the knowledge gained. Tactically, the project was a success, but the deeper strategic outcome was the realization of a limit. The officers now knew what it took to shoot down the B-17. The price was the exponential increase in risk for their own pilots and the acceptance that every bomber shot down would be replaced in a matter of weeks. Air warfare, they realized while flying those American cockpits, would not be won by the technical superiority of a single aircraft or the bravery of a handful of pilots. It would be won by the capacity to produce and persist, to absorb loss and keep flying. The B-17 captured and tested was not a trophy. It was a cold mirror reflecting the future of the conflict. The analysis of the captured B-17 did not end in the hangars or in the technical reports. It infiltrated the mindset of German strategists like a cold prophecy. The war would have been imagined as an exercise in pure tactical intelligence and technological superiority, was now revealed to be a brutal competition of resources and morale. What the Luftwaffe had was an elite body of pilots with years of combat experience. What the enemy had, and what the B-17 demonstrated in every bolt, was time and scale. And, in the chess of total war, these were the decisive elements. The perception that the flying fortress was almost instantly replaceable, while the experienced fighter pilot took years to train, created a silent crisis of morale. The veterans of the German regime, those who had celebrated the lightning victories of the early conflict, began to look at the sky not with the fury of the hunter, but with the weight of inevitability. They could shoot down one, perhaps two, but the formation continued. It was a fight against a hydra. For every head cut off, it seemed three sprouted in its place. This strategic dilemma turned into a deep moral dilemma, demanding a courage from the men that transcended mere obedience to orders, the courage to face their own futility. On the battlefront, frontal attack tactics became the rule, a desperate maneuver that exploited the bomber's vulnerability at its nose, but which placed a fighter pilot directly in the line of fire of the B-17's guns. The Luftwaffe knew what it had to do, but the price was steep. Many of the aces, forged in quick victories, found themselves in a race against time, where the only certainty was that, with every mission, the chances of return decreased drastically. Between obeying orders to defend the territory and the awareness that they were being sacrificed in a losing battle of scale, many discovered that the hardest war was the one they fought within themselves. Loyalty to the regime was tested not by easy heroism, but by the cold acceptance of the sacrifice imposed by a plan that already reeked of defeat. The Allied logistics, exposed to the German eye through the captured B-17, revealed a profound cultural and conflict management difference. While German engineers and designers prioritized speed and design refinement, often at the expense of mass production and robustness, the B-17 was the embodiment of the opposite philosophy: simplicity, endurance, and scale manufacturing. The aircraft, with its structure capable of withstanding unthinkable damage and returning to base, reflected the importance given to the crew's lives. The plane was robust so that the men could return. For the Luftwaffe technicians, this was more than an engineering feature. It was a statement of human value. Fear, in wartime, does not manifest only under fire. It disguises itself as bureaucracy, as strategic calculation. In those internal reports, fear was a realization that the enemy's production capacity was a weapon more lethal than any anti-aircraft gun. The war, for the Allies, became a question of replacement capability, while for the German regime, it was a matter of depletion. The Luftwaffe could shoot down thousands of planes, but the unspoken truth was that America could build 16 B-17s in a single day at the peak of production in 1944. This difference in scale was what the captured B-17 revealed. It was this knowledge that eroded the confidence of German commanders more than any battlefield defeat. What the B-17 Flying Fortress, with a German cross painted on it, symbolized for the German regime was the loss of the illusion of superiority. The episode served as an omen, a clear vision of the might that the enemy was willing to mobilize and sacrifice to win the war. The American engines, piloted by Luftwaffe men, resonated in the German skies not as a trophy, but as the tolling of a bell, perhaps to remind those who listened that time was running out. Decades later, what remains of this episode, more than the air attack tactics or the details of the plane's design, is a reflection on the nature of resilience and humanity under pressure. Courage was not just that of the gunner returning fire at 10,000 meters, but also that of the fighter pilot flying into certain death, knowing his sacrifice would ultimately be a desperate gesture against an uncontrollable force. Faith, in that context, became the last act of resistance. Faith in something greater than the machine, greater than the ideology. War teaches us that machines are extensions of human choices. The B-17 was more than metal. It was a declaration that engineering and mass production can sometimes be the most potent forms of resistance. The German regime sought victory in genius and aggression. The B-17, with its stubbornness to remain in the sky, symbolized victory in persistence and the ability to absorb suffering. Today, when we look at the black and white photographs of these bombers and imagine the slow, heavy sound of their four engines flying over Europe, we are not just looking at the history of a plane. We are examining the echo of moral choices made in a tiny, freezing cockpit. The plane is gone, reduced to scrap or restored in a museum, but the unspoken truth it revealed remains. War is not just about who has the best weapon, but about who has the longest breath and the moral and industrial capacity to resist until the end. The engines have been silent for a long time, and the snow has erased the footprints of the German soldiers and technicians who examined that captured B-17. But the weight of the decisions made based on what they found and the fear that the American fortress inspired still resonates in humanity's memory. The B-17 reminds us that the true strength of a fortress, flying or otherwise, lies not in its armor, but in the implicit promise that, no matter how hard the blow, there will always be a tomorrow to continue to fight.